Hi everybody, Professor Cruz here with some responses for your Week 2 Ethics in Action case studies. Thinking about this week's topic of climate change ethics, and some of the challenges and obstacles that we have to wrestle with thinking about questions of climate change ethics and future responsibility. So looking at how folks engage with the content this week, I think the main thing is that overall, pretty much everybody was in favor of extending some kind of recognition to climate refugees. And in fact, the majority of you felt that the United States and other countries that are major contributors to climate change should really be doing whatever they can to help try to address this growing problem. In terms of climate change itself, some of you wondered about the hurdles and challenges of addressing climate change, especially somewhere here like in the United States, where the kind of emphasis on individual private property and making money often sort of trumps the general public good, in particular protecting the environment. And so there's this kind of tension that people pointed out between wanting to take action and protect the climate and the environment more broadly, and the kind of incentives that we maybe have as a society, or particularly economically, that may discourage us from doing that, and how do we take those into account. Many of you suggested some kind of a tax. I don't think anyone specifically said a carbon tax, but something along those lines to help try to address climate change and to put a price on it so that we take it more seriously. And a number of you suggested maybe a kind of credit program or incentives of some kind, both to help cut down on particularly use of fossil fuels and to try to promote some kind of sustainable energy alternatives. One of the questions that a few of you raised had to do with, should people be responsible, or should corporations be responsible for paying for all the kind of impacts of climate change, especially when we think about big companies like BP or Shell or ExxonMobil, and they're the kind of the primary companies that benefited from decades and decades and decades of us buying and using lots of oil and gas and coal. But does that mean that they should be the ones paying for it, or should we as customers, or should all of us, or how do we kind of negotiate some of those questions? Was a question that people raised. And that's certainly a big part of debates around climate responsibility, is who and how do we associate past, present, and future carbon and climate emissions and impacts with those that are responsible in some way or another. Now, another point that some of you raised had to do with the ethical obligations to internally displaced people. So, and this kind of gets to a question that we touched on a little bit last week with our discussion about immigrant detainees, which is, do we have a kind of different ethical responsibility to citizens versus non-citizens, particularly in the context of climate change? So should we prioritize, let's say, refugees from Bangladesh who are having to leave because of rising sea levels there? Or do we prioritize people from Florida or Gulf Coast states who are also increasingly at risk from rising sea levels and increasing destructive storms, typhoons, hurricanes, things like that? And so this is a question about, how do we, from an ethical perspective, prioritize different people that are in need of help, and should kind of citizenship status play some factor in our sort of ethical deliberations? If so, why? If not, why not? And also, in theory at least, the U.S. has probably the most ability in terms of financial resources and technological know-how to be able to respond and adapt to many of these problems. So doesn't that both put a greater responsibility on the U.S. and also give us more ability to respond itself? So those are some of the other questions people raised. Another issue that some folks raised was a worry about, are we focusing too much on what might be fair? And in the process of debating what is fair in terms of responding to climate refugees, we end up doing nothing at all. Our action is the act of kind of disagreeing and debating and discussing, but not actually doing anything. So at least one or two of you asked, wouldn't it make more sense just to do something? Don't worry about whether it's fair or not, but just act, because that's better than just debating and not doing anything at all. Another somewhat related issue, and I think equally important one that was raised, was whether or not the U.S. can actually deal and manage with more climate refugees given our existing problems with the way U.S. handles immigration, particularly in the last few years with an extreme kind of push towards a hardline immigration policy that's framed around primarily punishment and detention rather than a more kind of humanitarian approach. So as one of you noted, so I'm not sure the U.S. is best equipped to handle climate refugees, as we have a very poor record with the treatment of refugees and immigrants. So thinking about maybe the U.S. is able to physically, accept more refugees, but are we kind of politically prepared and ready to be able to do that? So that's an important, different question that gets to a second kind of set of questions that are not purely about ethics, but about sort of our political responses and our ability to respond politically, regardless of whether or not we may think we have an ethical or moral obligation. Another student asked about how do we measure or can we measure a country's percentage of contribution to global warming, particularly in the context of thinking about how much responsibility the U.S. or any country might have. And the short answer is yes, there's a lot of different ways that scientists do that. If we look at some of the work done through the United Nations, IPCC, and kind of the international climate frameworks, there's, I think, something like a 5-volume set of kind of scientific methods for different ways that this question is trying to be answered. But one very common way is to look at output from power generation stations and power plants to calculate the amount of energy they're generating and then figure out how much pollution is being created in that process. So for example, if you take a ton of coal and let's say you burn it to make energy in a power plant, you could produce between about 3,000 and 6,000 pounds of CO2 in that process of burning that ton of coal, depending in that 3,000 to 6,000 range, depends on the type of coal, the oxygen content, the temperature it's burned, and a whole number of other technical factors. But we can estimate pretty accurately how much CO2 or methane or other greenhouse gases are being produced in the course of burning coal or gas or oil. And so if we know the amount being used, then we can get a pretty accurate estimate of how much is being released. Other ways that are commonly done is using geographical air sampling. And this could be doing chemical sampling of the air, using satellites to measure infrared frequencies in terms of specific chemical sort of fingerprints. The isotopes will reflect at different wavelengths, and so you can measure the amount and distribution. And you can do that both with satellites and now increasingly with laser or LiDAR technologies. And you can do that at a local level, at a regional level, at a national and an international level. So you've got things like the Integrated Carbon Observation System, the ICOS in Europe, which has a whole series of kind of sampling stations spread across Europe. You've got the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, which is one of the main observatories that NOAA and a lot of the climate scientists use in kind of the Pacific area to capture global and regional kind of carbon and other temperature changes. And you have kind of international efforts like the Global Atmosphere Watch Program, which is run by the World Meteorological Organization, or WMO, the Total Carbon Column Observing Network, or TCCON. And these are just kind of various sort of networks of international scientists that are all involved in some kind of weather and climate monitoring research. You can also do, for example, calculating how many vehicles are in any given area. You could do this in a city or a town or a region or a state or even a country, and kind of do an estimation on how many cars are licensed and on this road. What's the average kind of fuel efficiency miles per gallon for those cars? What's an average usage in a week? And you could do kind of rough estimates about outputs as well. And these are just a few of hundreds of different ways, depending on what pollutants and what kind of interest we're trying to get at. So there definitely are ways. We still don't have a sort of 100% clear picture, but we can get a pretty good snapshot in terms of local, kind of state, national, and then international to get a sense of who's contributing what percentage of different areas, aerosols, pollutants, greenhouse gases more broadly. So it's definitely something that we can do, even if we can't do it with 100% accuracy. In terms of the second part of the cases we are looking at, responsibility to future generations, again here overall, most of you felt that we do have some kind of an ethical obligation to think about and care for the future and our actions in relation to climate. And in fact, one of you noted that there's no success without successors, right? So this very kind of obvious point that if there is no people for the future, then the future suddenly doesn't exist either. And interestingly, some of you, in light of the readings this week, also wanted to extend this concern for the future, not just to humans, but to all of nature, other non-humans as well. And so this gets into some of the environmental ethics we were talking about this week. On this question about our obligation to future generations, I think another interesting question gets to this sort of bigger debate that we didn't really get into, but is kind of implicit in some of the articles in one way or another. It has to do with our kind of human nature itself and whether or not humans are inherently selfish or not. And if, for example, if we think humans are inherently selfish, then that will probably tell us a lot about how we should try to appeal to people in order to get actions, changes, responses to climate change. So if we're trying to appeal to some kind of moralistic concern in people, and that actually isn't what we're going to respond to, we're going to be much more likely to respond to a kind of instrumental, what's in it for me, what do I get out of it, how will it benefit me, that kind of ego, then maybe you need a different kind of approach. But whether we go one way or the other in part depends on both our own sort of view of what's the best ethical approach and what might work better or worse. But it also gets to this deeper question about how we think about human nature and how we then respond based on that assumption of people are this way or people are that way. Now, interestingly, on this question of extending moral concern and balancing human and non-human concerns when they come into conflict, and so this is one of the tensions we read about with the biocentric ethic, is that it might be able to tell us that we should give all mammals equal ethical weight or status, but what happens when two people or two groups come into conflict, then how do we negotiate that question? And what we saw was that there was a range of different opinions on how to respond to that, but pretty much everybody that came down in favor of what our literature describes as the kind of anthropocentric position, this one of humans over other species, the argument for that was made from a religious perspective or justified through a religious perspective. Whereas others of you felt that humans, we have the ability to adapt and move in ways that, for example, trees and plants can't do and many other species can't. And so we should give more weight to non-humans over humans precisely because we not only have more ability to adapt, but also in many cases we're the ones that are destroying someone else's backyard, someone else's home, rather than vice versa. And so there's sort of a greater ethical obligation on us. Just because we're humans doesn't mean we have a right to trash someone else's home. Now, interestingly here, still some others argued that maybe we should still give humans priority, but maybe we don't need to have or shouldn't think about as many conflicts as are occurring today if people took kind of the religious obligation of stewardship more seriously. So, and this is where you see kind of interesting examples of how some of the debates in religion and ecology can take us in very different directions, right? So on one hand, we have the dominion mandate where, God gave Adam and Eve the power to name and rule over all the beasts and creatures on land and sea and in the air, and others that say, well, the Garden of Eden is something that God gave to humans to steward, and our obligations back to kind of the Creator is to take care of those. And so both of those come from kind of a religious standpoint, but they give us sort of different ethical kind of end goals we might lead to. And so this is really a good example, just within the opinions from different people here in class on this question about how kind of our deeper philosophical views and our religious views can kind of come together to shape our ethical worldview and also take us in very different directions because of these underlying assumptions. And whether or not we think, for example, nature might have some kind of inherent value and therefore has ethical worth or moral worth. And this is, as I said, a good example of these kind of anthropocentric, biocentric, and ecocentric different ethics that we've been reading about and discussing this week, kind of playing out in people's responses. So just as like a final kind of example here, for those of you, most folks in this class are on the younger side, so you may not remember this history, but there was this important period in the 90s that was known as the Timber Wars. that really began in 1990 with known as Redwood Summer in California, where you had environmentalists fighting to protect redwoods and old growth forests in California and along all of the Pacific Northwest. And what we saw there was essentially a clash between sort of ecocentric or biocentric politics on one hand and an anthropocentric sort of human ethics driven by profit on the other. And the result, at least in that early period of the wars, was a lot of California's old growth that had still been alive and standing in that period in the kind of the end of the 80s into the early 90s were essentially logged and cut down by Max Sam and Charles Hurwitz and others. And that played an important part in kind of galvanizing environmental opinions in California. But at the same time, we can look at kind of an opposite example in that period and then up to more recent times, where you've seen conservation and other groups coming together to try to restore habitats, and in some cases in areas that had been logged previously in this earlier period in the 90s, trying to reforest those areas and help bring back salmon and trout and other fish whose population numbers have been declining in the Pacific Northwest, in some cases tied up with dam removal and other kind of environmental conservation restoration efforts that were driven much more by a sort of biocentric or ecocentric environmental ethic. So you can see even just in California in a short period of time, we can see some of these different kind of environmental ethics playing out in sort of real world politics. Okay, so those are just a few of the different examples I wanted to mention and some of the highlights and kind of common themes and questions that people raised going through thinking about our ethics and action case study this week. So I enjoyed reading people's responses. I hope the readings and materials this week were interesting again. And we're pivoting now to our third and final week, where we'll continue these questions of ethics and justice and religion, but take a little more kind of specific focus on questions of justice, what we might call social justice, racial justice, as we move forward. Okay, thanks everybody. Talk to you again soon. Bye.